Make yourself comfortable. Today we're going to have an aperitif with three faithful friends we all have in common, who usually show up at your place and mine without warning: fungi, yeasts, and bacteria. These invasive living beings, which can even act like real rotters when preservation is lacking, are actually excellent and essential cooks. Cooks who, in their own way, have shaken up the world to the point of making civilizations rise and fall. We often forget, but smoked ham, wine, those little sauces you made with yogurt to dip carrots in, like all the other foods around me, are the result of expertly controlled putrefaction. Let me explain. This unpasteurized yogurt contains an astronomical amount of living bacteria, around 100 million per gram. In other words, in this little pot of yogurt, there are 1,250,000,000 bacteria called Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus. These bacteria work in large numbers for our enjoyment, transforming the sugars in milk into lactic acid, which is much easier to digest. On cheeses whose fermentation processes are much longer, more complex, and diverse, a real ecosystem has developed and started the party without you. Depending on the cheese, there are between 1 and 2 dominant species of bacteria and between 1 and 7 dominant species of fungi. In a pasteurized industrial beer, the cooks have been eradicated before bottling. But during their preparation, between 10 and 20 million yeast cells, which are a type of fungus without mycelium, are added on average for each milliliter of liquid. A beer is therefore the collective work of several billion yeast cells. Yet, I imagine that, like me, at no point do these foods make you think of rotting processes. Yet, the definition of putrefaction is literally the decomposition of organic matter by the action of bacteria or fungi. And without it, the Holy Trinity, bread, sausage, and beer, that gives a bit more meaning to our short time on Earth, wouldn't exist. Whether you think with your stomach or not, in cooking there is a truth that no one can escape. Any food humans can eat, whether animal or plant, deteriorates due to the action of microorganisms present in their environment. And they're everywhere. So, since the beginning of humanity, our species has had to find ingenious ways to deal with the presence of this cohort of invisible beings that attack food. And to protect ourselves from them, there are only 3 ways to do it. Obviously, you can try to be faster than them, and for that, you have to eat everything before it goes bad. You can also try to slow them down by salting or smoking meats, for example. Or you can look among all that rot for allies, so that when the original food starts to turn, it doesn't become disgusting, but instead turns into something edible and, if possible, delicious. Let's take a leap through time. The women and men who hunted and gathered for food in the Neolithic era were constantly competing with 2 types of predators. Those clearly visible in the landscape denied them access to the same plants and products. We believe it was them. And those much more discreet, the decomposers, who quickly attacked the flesh of the killed game as well as the fallen fruits. To fight and eradicate these invisible and sometimes pathogenic organisms, which tried to steal the mammoth steak right from their mouths, our ancestors had only one weapon: cooking. Except that, just like today, there were absent-minded people. People like you and me who often forgot something at the back of the cave, the pantry, or the fridge. And it was these people who, throughout history and in every region of the world, let milk, meat, fruits, or vegetables rot under certain conditions, unintentionally allowed for fascinating discoveries. Most of the time, when you let something rot in a corner, you don't get anything good out of it. The food turns into something that is certainly visually fascinating, but often disgusting, even absolutely inedible. Parasites can develop in meat that could make you regret being born or make your remaining days melt away like snow in the sun. Certain pathogenic bacteria such as Escherichia coli, Salmonella, or Listeria can literally shake the food industry by causing food safety scandals. As for molds and other types of rot, they generally cause what is called a foodborne infection. I think we've all been there. Worldwide, it's estimated that each year, 600 million people are affected by this kind of infection, and 420,000 people die from it. But it also happens, more rarely, that an ordinary food becomes extraordinary, that something new, delicious, even intoxicating emerges. These are friendly forms of rot, generally called ferments, which are responsible for the aroma of coffee and cocoa. Yeasts, on the other hand, can break down the long sugar chains in grapes or malt and turn them into ethanol. They also produce CO2, which makes bread dough rise. And it's thanks to the lactic acid bacteria found in yogurt, sauerkraut, salami, and pickles that sugars are transformed into lactic acids, which make the environment unlivable for pathogenic bacteria. A major advantage for preservation and a delight for the taste buds. Very early on, nearly 8,000 years ago, small clusters of purplish fruits were even specifically domesticated to be pressed and left to rot, thus allowing the arrival on earth of Dionysus, god of the vine, wine, celebration, and its excesses. By learning over time to take advantage of these beneficial rots, humanity moved from competition to cooperation, by choosing to form an alliance with communities of microscopic organisms. Fermentation lies at the center of these fortunate encounters with life unseen by the naked eye. A collaborative art that's really just controlled rot, achieved by adjusting the temperature, the amount of salt, oxygen, or available water. And each time, the result is something that is neither raw nor cooked, but always in the process of becoming. Without heating the food, the microorganisms that develop in it can break down and disrupt the protein chains. In the sausage, the result is that the meat becomes tender to bite into. In milk, the bacteria break down the lactose. In bread, they pre-digest the gluten, making these foods more digestible each time. For thousands of years, these collaborations, these chemical dances, where humans propose and microbes dispose, have allowed humanity to get through the seasons, to preserve food, to reinvent flavors, to still be able to chew when teeth become scarce, and maybe also to feel more at home in the world. What is intriguing about these culinary encounters between humans and microorganisms is that they are very ancient. In fact, they are so ancient that we think that without people like you and me, brave enough or reckless enough to invite rot to their table, humanity might never have become sedentary, and the domestication of living things might never have happened. You'll see, it's fascinating. In 2018, a publication from Stanford University revealed that the earliest traces of cereal fermentation date back more than 13,000 years. More than 2 millennia before the invention of agriculture, human populations had already perfected the art of deliberately making things rot. In fact, traces of spelt, barley, and wild oats transformed into a fermented drink have been found in caves in northern Israel, giving rise to food. The oldest known alcoholic beverage in history, which was certainly much weaker than a modern German lager. This anecdote may seem trivial to you, yet this discovery turns the order of things as we like to tell them upside down. These human communities did not invent beer from domesticated resources. The first known beer in history was made from wild species and predates agriculture and domestication. The Neolithic revolutions may have started with a drink and an alliance with microorganisms. The hypothesis is being seriously studied. This type is not limited to just beers and cereals. The first traces of grape fermentation also predate the domestication of the vine, and the oldest cheese residues appear before cattle farming. By staying in the same place, close to animals and plants they could consume over longer periods without having to move, humans were able to initiate selection processes, called domestications, with microbes and other forms of rot. The discovery and then mastery of these fermentation processes even had beneficial effects on Neolithic populations. When eaten in large quantities, foods like grains or wild cabbage, for example, can be toxic. Milk was very hard to digest for people of that time once they reached adulthood. But when transformed into bread, sauerkraut, or yogurt, these foods become easier to digest, lose their toxicity, and could take a bigger place in the diet, giving us time to begin the long process of domesticating plants. One example among many, olives are inedible if you try to eat them right after picking them from the tree. To eat them, you have to leave them for a while in salted water, deprived of oxygen, and in the presence of bacteria that will soften them and break down the molecules that initially give them a bitter taste. Fermentation also helps preserve vitamins, which under normal conditions oxidize quickly and eventually disappear, leading to deficiencies over time. It is especially thanks to vitamin C preserved in sauerkraut that many sailors were able to avoid scurvy during the great expeditions of the 17th and 18th centuries. And if we add to all this the fact that by transforming the texture of foods, fermentation also improved the taste, to make them softer, easier to chew, while greatly increasing their palatability. Yes, it's a real word that means it makes you want to eat them and makes it enjoyable. Once you taste them, you understand that these forms of rot have become allies, and why fermentation is absolutely everywhere around us. Today, beer is the third most consumed beverage in the world, after water and tea. And depending on the country, from 5 to 40% of the foods and drinks we consume are in fermented form, with more than 5,000 different culinary preparations listed. In Western Europe, we're actually at the top of the list, especially in France, where we consume 50 kilos of fermented dairy products per person per year. And where it gets mind-blowing is when you convert that into the number of species ingested, or should I say welcomed. We reach more than 1,000 different species of microorganisms per person per day, and that's just with dairy products. Which means that every time you invite friends over for dinner, you're actually sitting at the table with nearly 1,000 species. Their creations, which usually have a strong and pronounced taste, also represent an important part of the cultural identity of different peoples. If you leave France, what you'll miss is the cheese, the baguette, and probably the sausage. In Germany, sauerkraut, cold cuts, and black bread. Many Japanese people travel with their soy sauce. The Vietnamese will certainly tell you about a nem chua, a kind of sausage from there that has a specific window when it's meant to be eaten. If you buy it too early, you have to wait a certain amount of time for it to be properly fermented before you can eat it. In Iceland, one of the traditional dishes, hakal, is made by fermenting Greenland shark meat, which has the particularity of being as toxic as it is disgusting. Since these sharks don't have a urinary system, the urea spreads throughout their flesh before being sweated out. It's hard to throw away half a ton of meat during the polar winter when it gets caught in your nets. So, the Icelanders came up with a recipe that involves letting a good slice of this puzzling meat rot under gravel for 3 months. Then they smoke it for another 3 months in a hut before eating this dish, which is known for smelling strongly of cheese, fish, and urine. I didn't want to buy any to try it, since I think it's a sacrilege to eat animals that can live for nearly 400 years, but I think the reactions of non-Icelanders who have tried it, which you can find all over social media, show just how horrifying this thing is. And that's just one example among many, showing that disgust can be influenced by cultural constructs. It's not easy to try natto, that dish of fermented soybeans, if you're not Japanese. As for surströmming, please excuse my pronunciation, those cans of fermented herring are often bulging because they're pressurized by the gases produced by the bacteria inside. It's customary to open them in a well-ventilated area or even underwater because the smell is so unbearable. And it's rare for non-Swedes to think it's a good idea to eat it. The fact that many of these fermented foods are real turn-offs for those who've never tasted them is easy to understand. It's an evolutionary legacy that's found universally in all humans. No matter your culture, if the process of decay is advanced, the strong smell associated with it should make you wary, and your survival instinct should give you a strong urge to stay away from it. If the feeling of disgust has been selected in this way, it's to prevent us from ingesting foods that could be potentially dangerous for us. That's why we had to learn to tame these powerful flavors, by using them sparingly, pairing them with other ingredients, or accompanying them with strong drinks, which are also often fermented and alcoholic. For example, you wouldn't think of eating an entire Roquefort cheese without bread, and it goes well with a glass of red wine. And all these dishes, which are monuments of our cultural heritage, are not just due to our cooking skills. They are also the work of entire ecosystems that remained unknown for a very long time. Before the 17th century and the invention of the microscope, even though humans had been practicing fermentation for millennia, it was impossible for us to understand its cause, because a whole part of the living world, the microscopic world, was inaccessible to us. Even after the first microscopes were invented, it took another 2 centuries and the arrival of Louis Pasteur to reveal the role of these tiny organisms in fermentation, and finally be able to discover and understand how those who had been cooking for us all this time actually worked. Before Pasteur, there were indeed some attempts to explain it. Some, like Aristotle, believed that fermentation resulted from spontaneous generation, during which molds, fungi, and even maggots were thought to magically form from inanimate matter. Others, like the 16th century alchemist Paracelsus, supposed the existence of a ferment, a kind of almost spiritual vital force, which would be responsible for fermentation and the appearance of rot in food. The first chemists to look into the mystery of these occurrences in the 16th century saw them as the result of reactions similar to combustion. But no one, whether in Europe or elsewhere, seems to have put forward the hypothesis of the existence of invisible living beings developing and transforming food from the inside. At the same time, it's not easy to imagine that in the creamy, spotless white of a yogurt, there are highways of microorganisms skilled in cooking, moving around and working by the billions. By revealing to us an entire part of the great tree of life that was unknown to us, the scientists who led to the emergence of modern microbiology greatly expanded our view of the world and transformed our relationship with food. In 1865, Louis Pasteur filed a patent for a process that still bears his name and would make the rise of the modern food industry possible: pasteurization. The principle is relatively simple. Eradicate the microorganisms naturally present in basic foods by heating and then quickly cooling them, and, if desired, add only the specific yeasts or bacteria you want. And so, after being for millennia something like a miracle achieved by trial and error, the selection of microbial species has gradually transformed over the past 2 centuries into a cutting-edge scientific and technological field. A great many fermentation processes are now fully under control, with microbial species studied from every angle, modified, standardized, and patented by research laboratories all over the world, whether it's for making bread, cheese, wine, tofu, miso, or soy sauce. This work is of course essential for food safety, but too much selection can have unfortunate consequences. The most striking example is perhaps that of the white rind of camembert, going by the charming name Penicillium camemberti. In Penicillium, you of course recognize penicillin, and that's normal because it's to this family of fungi, which has been at war with bacteria for millions of years, that we owe the development of the very first antibiotic. Mels. By infesting the entire outer part of the cheese, the harmless and delicious mold known as Penicillium camemberti prevents all other molds or bacteria from settling there. Today, the rind of all camemberts is white, but up until the 1950s, different fungi were used, which could give orange, gray, or green spots. And then, everyone started using the same albino variant, the same strain. So it's not only the same species, but the same individual that has been inoculated for decades in all camemberts and all brie cheeses. And where it becomes problematic is that this cloning or vegetative multiplication doesn't allow our friendly fungus to mix its genes. In other words, by entering the cheese business, Penicillium had to say goodbye to the sex it normally practiced in the wild. In the same way that an orchid will have trouble blooming in your apartment, Penicillium camemberti doesn't have the necessary conditions to produce sexual spores in the cheese-making environment. Mutation after mutation, without genetic mixing, the strain becomes weaker. So our guest here is on the verge of burnout, and researchers are working on protocols to help it regain a fulfilling sex life, or even to find it a replacement. Maybe even crazier, what connects us to these microorganisms goes far beyond the kitchen and even touches our innermost selves. Because while fermentation allows us to pre-digest food, when that food ends up in our stomachs, it's ultimately other microorganisms that are also responsible for digesting it. Once introduced into your digestive tract, what we call probiotics will not just become inhabitants of your body, but a part of your body and even of your psyche. By joining your microbiota, the immense cohort of bacteria in your digestive tract. Good digestion is a pillar of our physical health, and this has always been known. In the Middle Ages, it was common to ask someone about their health by asking how their bowel movements were going. Digestive problems were so central to daily life. Current problems like food intolerance or increasingly common syndromes such as irritable bowel syndrome have put our digestion back at the center of our health concerns. But what has also been discovered recently is that your digestive system also has a significant impact on your mental health. You probably know this. You have as many neurons in your gut as this monkey has in its skull. That's about 500 million neurons spread along your digestive tract. And this second brain, or as specialists call it, the enteric nervous system, doesn't work alone. It works closely with the thousands of microorganisms that inhabit our guts to form a single functional organ, which is shaped by your DNA, but also by the DNA of millions of other bacteria. Weighing up to 2 kilograms in adults, this symbiotic ecosystem does more than just digest. It also influences our immune system, reduces inflammation, and even produces key neuroactive molecules such as serotonin. Conversely, our mental activity can also have an impact on our microbiota. Everyone has already experienced this. Strong emotions are often felt in the stomach. Think about the fact that our greatest fears and heartbreaks can be perceived by a vast microscopic ecosystem. That can be a bit unsettling. But if we follow this reasoning to the end, the living being with whom you have the most intimate connection may not be your best friend or your companion, whether human, dog, or cat. It might be bacterial. On the other hand, our microbiota can also have an impact on our psyche. Its involvement is now recognized in disorders such as anxiety, depression, or schizophrenia. Sometimes it's an overpopulation of certain bacteria that seems to play a role in the problem. In other cases, it's the scarcity or presence of specific bacteria that is singled out. For example, it has been shown in both mice and humans that transferring the microbiota from a patient with depression to a healthy patient can trigger depression. Today, to better understand the mechanisms behind these different mental disorders, researchers are particularly interested in the links between the bacteria in our gut and the vagus nerve, which connects the gut directly to an area in the brain associated with emotions. Maybe we're actually the ones feeling their emotions. In fact, the links between the central nervous system and our digestive tract are so strong that early signs of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's can be detected through gastric problems. Our digestive system is certainly not the most glamorous part of our anatomy, but it's definitely one of the most fascinating. Consider that this inner world we host and with which we share a common destiny is actually outside our body, just like the bacteria responsible for fermentation that live there. You heard me right. Your gut is outside your body. Let me explain. We all start our lives as just a few cells, barely visible to the naked eye. After fertilization, the first cell divides rapidly, and this little growing sphere then takes on the shape of a donut before a first opening forms where what will later become our anus. Then, this primitive opening will extend and take the shape of a tube running through the organism, connecting to our future mouth. Throughout embryonic development, this tube will lengthen until it becomes our digestive system, which, in adults, measures nearly 6 meters. In short, biology, at first, is a bit like origami. It's the outside of our body that has folded inward. And the surface of the digestive system is an absolutely gigantic living space when you're the size of a bacterium. especially since our intestine, the main residence of our microbiota, is not smooth. Its walls are covered with fractal structures made up of millions of folds with a hairy appearance, forming an immense absorptive surface in contact with the nutrients from food. All in all, if you were to unfold and smooth out this entire lining, which I don't recommend you do, it would cover an area equivalent to that of a tennis court. At your next get-together with friends, just remember that you're witnessing a gathering of several tennis courts worth of bacteria that have come together around creations made by other microbes to enjoy and get intoxicated. For 4 billion years, microorganisms have continued to rule this planet. It's absolutely normal that they're invited to the party. And before we part ways, let me wipe the slate clean and share with you one of the basic techniques to start practicing the ancient art of lacto-fermentation yourself. To start, simply take vegetables that inspire you. I went with carrots, onions, peppers, along with a few cloves of garlic and some ginger. Let's clarify that you don't need milk for this recipe, because the term lacto here refers to lactic acid released by bacteria, which will do the work for you. Next, get yourself a jar like this one, clean but not sterile, with a small seal that will prevent air from getting in, while allowing the gas produced during fermentation to escape without making the jar explode. And now, pay attention. This is the hardest part of the recipe. We need to prepare a brine, in other words, salted water. Mix 2 tablespoons of salt into a liter of water. That's the hardest part done. Now just rinse your vegetables, no need to sterilize them. You don't want to kill the tiny organisms on their surface. Then pack down these vegetables. Nothing should stick out of the brine. Remember to leave a few centimeters of air above the mixture, then close it up. And there you go. It's ready. All you have to do now is wait. Leave the jar at room temperature for about a week, then 2 weeks in the fridge. You can organize a get-together and invite your friends to come and taste a recipe cooked by bacteria. Finally, when your creation arrives on your guests' plates, avoid calling it lacto-fermented vegetables. Prefer the term pickles, because for us humans, the name of the dish also influences its palatability. The next time you come across a forgotten food in your fridge, I hope you'll see it as a proposal made by rot, an attempt by microbes to explore new possibilities. Of course, nothing obliges you to accept it.